How does a hand, sworn to heal, learn to shatter bone? What dark bargain is struck when a man who takes a vow of poverty finds himself guarding mountains of gold? This is the story of an idea that became an army, a prayer that became a battle cry. It begins not with the clash of steel, but with the quiet whisper of a dying pilgrim in a squalid Jerusalem hospital, a city drowning in the blood of its supposed liberation. Why would the charter of an order founded on the principle of charity, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, eventually contain more regulations on the maintenance of a war horse than on the dressing of a wound? The answer is not found in dusty theological texts, but in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of survival. In the year 1099, the soldiers of the First Crusade had taken the Holy City. They had waded through streets slick with the gore of its inhabitants, believing they were doing God's work. Yet in the aftermath of this holy slaughter, a different kind of work continued. In a hospital founded decades earlier by a humble monk known as the Blessed Gerard, the work was not killing, but mending. Here, the distinctions that had fueled the crusade dissolved in the face of suffering. A knight with a festering arrow wound lay beside a Saracen merchant, cut down in the chaos. A Jewish artisan with a broken leg received the same care as a pilgrim from Normandy. Gerard's mission was simple, radical, and seemingly suicidal in this New World order: to care for our lords, the sick and the poor, regardless of their faith or origin. But paradise, even a blood-soaked one, has its serpents. The roads to Jerusalem were not highways of salvation, they were gauntlets of terror, infested with bandits, deserters, and local warlords who saw the influx of pilgrims as a river of portable wealth. A pilgrim who survived the journey to the coast, the diseases of the camps, and the heat of the desert could have their throat cut for a few silver coins just miles from the Holy Sepulchre. The brothers of the hospital would find them, broken and bleeding, and carry them back. They would stitch their wounds, feed them, and pray for their souls. But prayers could not stop a blade in the dark. The accounts from those early years are filled with a grim, repetitive rhythm. A caravan attacked, pilgrims slaughtered, the few survivors brought to the hospital. The brothers, men of peace, began to ask a terrible question. What is the good of healing a man only to send him back out to be killed? Can mercy exist without a sword to protect it? The dilemma was not academic. It was a matter of life and death, played out daily on the dusty roads of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The first to take up arms were not knights, but hired guards, mercenaries paid from the order's growing donations to escort pilgrim groups. But this created another problem. The loyalty of hired men was as thin as the coins they were paid with. A better offer, or a fight that seemed too costly, could see them vanish into the desert haze, leaving their charges to fate. The internal struggle must have been agonizing. These were men who had renounced the world, who had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Their days were meant to be filled with prayer and service, their hands meant for the gentle arts of medicine. To take a life was to stain the soul, a direct violation of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Yet, to stand by while the innocent were slaughtered felt like a different kind of sin, a sin of omission, of cowardice. The chronicles are silent on the precise moment the first brother himself picked up a spear, but it was inevitable. It likely happened not in a council chamber, but in a desperate, dusty skirmish, a moment when a brother, seeing a pilgrim about to be struck down, dropped his medical kit, seized a fallen weapon, and did what he had to do. That single act, born of desperation, was a Rubicon crossed. The order of the hospital, the sanctuary of the sick, was beginning to learn the savage grammar of violence. It was a language it would soon master. They built hospitals that could withstand a siege and fortresses where you could treat wounds. Therein lay their genius and their curse. What is more terrifying, to die by an enemy's sword or at the hands of one who vowed to heal you? The transformation was gradual at first, a creeping necessity that slowly rewrote the very DNA of their fraternity. They started by escorting their own supply trains, then small groups of pilgrims. They were clumsy warriors, monks, playing at being soldiers. Their armor was ill-fitting, their swordplay ragged. But they had something mercenaries lacked, a fanatic's conviction. They were not fighting for gold, but for the lives of our lords, the sick, a duty they considered sacred. Their first battles were likely desperate, ugly affairs, more brawls than tactical engagements, but they learned. In the crucible of the desert skirmish, they learned how to form a shield wall, how to brace against a cavalry charge, how to kill efficiently. And with each victory, with each successful escort, their reputation grew. Pilgrims began to seek the protection not of royal patrols, but of the armed brothers of St. John. Kings and nobles, seeing their effectiveness, began to grant them land and castles, not just as donations but as strategic assets. They were reliable, they were disciplined, and they were cheap, for they fought not for pay, but for salvation. The world was forcing them to change, and they were adapting with terrifying speed. The debate was no longer whether a monk could shed blood, but how to do so in the most organized, effective, and spiritually justifiable way possible. This shift from a purely charitable organization to a military one created a deep, philosophical schism within the order itself. There were the purists who followed the original vision of the Blessed Gerard. They argued that their only duty was to the sick, that to take up the sword was to become the very thing they fought against, to let the violence of the world infect their sacred mission. On the other side were the pragmatists who saw the world for what it was, a place where the gentle were devoured. They argued that their vow to protect the poor and the pilgrims was meaningless if they lacked the power to do so. A hospital, they contended, was useless if its patients were butchered on the road to its gates. This was not a simple argument between doves and hawks. It was a battle for the soul of the order. The pragmatists, led by the second master of the order, Raymond Dupuy, ultimately won. They did not abandon their healing mission, they fused it with a military one, creating a hybrid creature the world had never seen before. It was a paradox made flesh, a monastic order of elite professional soldiers. The vow of the Hospitaller was no longer just a vow to heal, it was a vow to protect, and in the brutal landscape of the Crusader states, protection meant the willingness and the ability to kill. The irony was savage. To fulfill their mission of Christian charity, they had to become masters of a very un-Christian art. The hand that could expertly bind a wound had to become equally expert at inflicting one. The mind that studied herbal remedies also had to study battlefield tactics. They were creating a new kind of man, one who could recite the Latin Mass in the morning, amputate a gangrenous leg at noon, and lead a cavalry charge in the afternoon. This dual identity would become their greatest strength and their most profound tragedy. It allowed them to survive and thrive in an environment where pure charity would have been extinguished, but it also set them on a path where the line between defender and aggressor, between protector and predator, would become dangerously blurred. The world saw them as holy warriors, lions of God, but within the walls of their chapter houses they must have grappled with the terrifying knowledge that to save their souls, they were engaging in acts that could very well damn them. The first blood they shed in defense of pilgrims was a necessary evil, but soon they would be shedding blood for territory, for politics, and for power. The vow taken in Jerusalem was not broken. It mutated into something far more complex and dangerous. A vow to heal had become an order to kill. Was their first sin picking up the sword, or was it the moment they realized they were good at it? Tell us what you think in the comments. Was this a fall from grace, a necessary survival, or a holy evolution? The informal reality of armed monks soon demanded a formal structure, a theological and legal framework to sanctify their new, blood-soaked vocation. This came in the year 1113, when Pope Pascal II issued the bull Pi Postulatio Voluntatis. While it primarily affirmed the order's independence and its charitable mission, it crucially placed the Hospitallers directly under the protection of the Holy See. This was a political masterstroke. It freed them from the meddling of local bishops and feudal lords, allowing them to operate as a sovereign power, accountable only to the Pope. It was the foundation upon which their future empire would be built. But the true military transformation was codified under the rule of Raymond Dupuy, who succeeded Gerard. Around the year 1130, he introduced a formal class system within the order, a revolutionary act that officially married the monastery to the barracks. The order was divided into three classes of men. First, there were the knight brothers, who had to be of noble birth. These were the elite, the heavy cavalry, the commanders. They were the sword and shield of the order. Second came the sergeant brothers, or serving brothers, who were not of noble lineage. They served as infantry, squires, and administrators, the backbone of the military machine. Finally, there were the chaplains, the priests, who saw to the spiritual needs of the brothers and their patients, but who were forbidden from fighting. This structure mirrored the feudal society outside their walls, but with a crucial difference: it was all bound by monastic vows. This new rule, the Charter of Raymond Dupuy, was a document of breathtaking ambition. It laid out, in meticulous detail, the dual life of the hospitaller. It prescribed the hours of prayer, the rules for tending the sick, and the strictures of a monastic life. But woven throughout were the regulations of a professional army. There were rules for the maintenance of armor, the care of war horses, and the chain of command in battle. A brother's life was now a rigid sequence of prayer, hospital duty, and military drills. They rose before dawn for matins, spent hours in the armory practicing with sword and lance, attended to the sick in the great wards, and ended their day with compline. There was no room for individuality, no space for doubt. Obedience was absolute. The Grand Master, the head of the order, held the power of life and death over his brethren. A knight who disobeyed an order in battle could be stripped of his mantle and flogged in public. A brother who deserted his post faced expulsion and excommunication. This was not the gentle charity of the blessed Gerard. This was the creation of a human weapon, forged in piety and tempered in discipline. They were building a spiritual war machine, more loyal, more disciplined, and more fanatical than any feudal army a king could muster. They didn't just add a sword to their cross, they reforged the cross into a sword. The first test of this new military structure came not in a grand battle, but in the gritty, essential work of securing the kingdom. The Hospitallers were granted control of key castles along the perilous pilgrim routes. These were not palaces, they were stark, functional fortresses, often perched on strategic mountain passes or overlooking vital coastal roads. Places like Beth Gibbelin in the south, a bulwark against raids from the Egyptian garrison at Ascalon, or the mighty fortress of Plata, which they would later transform. They became the kingdom's guardians. Their mounted patrols, identifiable by their black mantles bearing a white cross, became a common and welcome sight for terrified pilgrims. Unlike feudal lords who might flee to their own lands in times of crisis, the Hospitallers were permanent. The Holy Land was their only home, its defense their only purpose. They were the first responders to any Saracen raid, the first to reinforce a besieged city, the first to charge in battle. Their reputation for ferocity grew. They fought with a cold, disciplined fury that unnerved their enemies. They did not break ranks, they did not retreat unless ordered, and they took no prisoners, a grim reality of the perpetual holy war. This new role came at a cost both in blood and in treasure. The order's expenses soared. Maintaining castles, equipping knights, and feeding a standing army was ruinously expensive. To fund their holy war, they created one of the most sophisticated logistical and financial networks of the Middle Ages. They established commanderies, or administrative estates, all across Europe. These estates, donated by pious nobles and kings, produced grain, wine, and wool, the profits from which were funneled directly to the Holy Land. They became international bankers, offering secure ways for pilgrims and crusaders to transfer wealth without the risk of carrying gold through bandit-infested lands. A nobleman in France could deposit a sum with the local hospitaller commandery and receive a letter of credit, which he could then redeem for cash in Jerusalem. They were pioneering a system that would later be perfected by their rivals, the Knights Templar. Their initial vow of poverty had twisted into a new shape. The individual brother owned nothing, not even the clothes on his back. But the order itself was becoming fantastically wealthy. It was a necessary contradiction. To fund their charitable war, they had to become masters of worldly finance. They were no longer just monks or soldiers, they were now princes of the church, feudal lords and international financiers, a multinational corporation dedicated to war and medicine. Their fortresses became the ultimate expression of their dual identity. Within the formidable stone walls, one would find not only barracks, armories and stables, but also fully functioning hospitals, built to the highest standards of the time. The Great Ward of the hospital in Jerusalem was a marvel, a vast hall capable of holding over 2,000 patients. It was clean, well ventilated and staffed by brothers who were skilled in practical medicine. They knew how to set bones, stitch wounds, and use herbal anesthetics. They understood the importance of hygiene, a concept lost on most of medieval Europe. A sick pilgrim arriving at a hospital or castle would be given a hot bath, a clean bed with fresh linens, and a nourishing meal. Their spiritual needs were attended to, but their physical ailments were treated with a surprising degree of scientific rigor. This was the paradox in stone and mortar. A traveler approaching a hospital or castle saw a menacing symbol of military power designed to kill and to dominate the landscape. But if that same traveler were sick or wounded, those same walls represented the best hope of survival, a sanctuary of healing in a savage land. These castles were the physical embodiment of their soul, a hardened, militarized exterior, protecting a core of genuine compassion. To protect this core, the walls had to become ever thicker, the towers ever higher, the soldiers ever more ruthless. This demand for ultimate security would lead them to construct the most magnificent fortress the Crusader world would ever see, a masterpiece of military architecture that was more than a castle. It was a statement carved in limestone, basalt, and sheer audacity. Its name was the Crac des Chevaliers. That statement was carved into the Jebel Ansariya mountain range in modern-day Syria, a sentinel guarding the Homs Gap, the only major pass between the coast and the interior. The site had been fortified since the Emir of Homs built a small castle there in the 11th century, but when the Hospitallers took possession of it in 1142, they began a project of breathtaking scale and ambition. The Crac des Chevaliers, the Castle of the Knights, was not merely built, it was sculpted from the mountain itself. For over a century, the Order's master engineers and thousands of laborers transformed the site into the epitome of fortress design, a concentric castle that was, for its time, virtually impregnable. It was, in truth, two castles in one. An outer wall bristling with 13 massive towers enclosed a vast courtyard. Within this, separated by a deep rock-cut moat, rose the inner citadel, a self-contained fortress with its own chapel, great hall and storerooms. An attacker who managed to breach the outer wall would find themselves trapped in a killing ground, exposed to a merciless barrage of arrows and projectiles from the inner walls. It was a fortress designed not just to withstand a siege, but to mock it. Its strategic brilliance was matched only by its logistical genius. Inside its walls, the Crac could garrison up to 2,000 soldiers and their horses. Vast storerooms carved into the rock held enough grain, wine, and olive oil to endure a siege for 5 years. A sophisticated system of aqueducts and cisterns ensured a constant supply of fresh water. It even had its own windmill built into one of the towers to grind flour. The Crac was not a castle, it was a self-sufficient city-state dedicated to war. Life within the Crac was a perfect reflection of the Order's disciplined, dualistic nature. The ringing of the chapel bell for prayer was answered by the clang of hammers in the forge and the shouts of the drill sergeant in the bailey. Knights would practice jousting and swordsmanship in the outer ward, while just a few hundred feet away, in the infirmary, brother surgeons would be performing complex operations. The garrison was in a perpetual state of readiness, From the highest watchtower, lookouts could see for miles, monitoring the movement of caravans and armies. A system of signal fires could relay messages to other hospitaller castles, creating a rapid response network that controlled the entire region. The Knights of the Crack were the undisputed masters of their domain. They patrolled the countryside, protected the trade routes, and exacted tribute from local villages. They were the law, the government, and the army. They projected an aura of absolute power, and for over a century, that aura was enough. Great Muslim leaders, including the legendary Nur ad-Din and the mighty Saladin himself, brought their armies to the foot of the Crack, gazed up at its sheer, defiant walls, and decided to turn back. They knew that taking this fortress would cost them more in men and time than it was worth. The Crac de Chevalier was more than stone. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. It was the ultimate symbol of the Hospitallers' power in the Holy Land, a monument to their engineering prowess and their unshakable will. The Crack was not built to keep men out. It was built to keep an idea in, the idea that faith could be made of stone and kill from a distance. The castle was the nerve center for the Order's operations in northern Syria. From here, knights would launch lightning raids against enemy positions or ride to the relief of other Christian strongholds. They became masters of the hit-and-run tactic, using their superior heavy cavalry to smash into larger, less disciplined forces and then retreat to the safety of their fortress before a counterattack could be organized. They were the ultimate rapid deployment force of the medieval world. Their presence stabilized the entire northern frontier of the Crusader states, but their success bred a dangerous confidence, a belief in their own invincibility. They were the elite, the tip of the spear, and they knew it. This arrogance sometimes led them to make reckless decisions on the battlefield. At the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187, a battle that effectively destroyed the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and led to Saladin's recapture of the city, the Hospitaller Grand Master urged a fatal charge, a decision that contributed to the catastrophic defeat. They paid a heavy price for their pride. Nearly every Hospitaller knight present at the battle was killed or captured. Saladin, who was known for his chivalry, offered the captive Templar and Hospitaller knights a choice: convert to Islam or die. To a man, they chose martyrdom. It was a devastating blow, but the Order, with its vast European network, was able to replenish its ranks. The war machine ground on. Yet for all their military might, the Hospitallers never forgot their primary function. The hospital remained the heart of the Order. The great hospital in Jerusalem, which they were forced to abandon after Hattin, was replicated in their new headquarters in the city of Acre, and on a smaller scale in every castle they controlled. Their rules dictated that any sick person of any faith who came to their gates must be taken in and cared for. Chronicles from Muslim travelers of the period express astonishment at the quality of care provided by their sworn enemies. There are accounts of Muslim patients being allowed to pray towards Mecca from their hospital beds and being served food that complied with their dietary laws. It is a stunning testament to the resilience of their founding vow. Even as their knights were slaughtering Muslims on the battlefield, their doctors were healing them in the infirmary. How did they reconcile this? How could a man pray for the soul of a Saracen he was trying to save in the morning and then try to kill another Saracen in the afternoon? Perhaps they saw no contradiction. The knight's duty was to fight the enemies of Christ. The doctor's duty was to heal the sick. They were simply two different jobs performed by the same organization, two facets of the same sacred mission. But this delicate balance could only be maintained as long as they had a kingdom to defend. In the 13th century, the tide of history began to turn against the Crusader states. A new, formidable power was rising in Egypt and Syria, the Mamluk Sultanate. Unlike Saladin, the Mamluks were not interested in coexistence. They were methodical, ruthless, and determined to eradicate the Christian presence from the Holy Land forever. One by one, the great Crusader castles began to fall, and in 1271, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, a military genius and a master of siegecraft, arrived at the gates of the Crac des Chevaliers. The invincible fortress was about to face its ultimate test, but even the strongest walls are meaningless when the world around them is collapsing. The end was coming, not just for the Crac, but for the entire Crusader dream. The final act would be played out in the last Christian bastion on the mainland, a city of wealth, corruption, and desperation. Its name was Acre. Acre, in the late 13th century, was not a holy city. It was a cage filled with frightened kings, squabbling merchant republics, and military orders who trusted each other even less than they trusted the enemy at the gates. It was the last capital of the dying Kingdom of Jerusalem, a sliver of coastline crowded with refugees and ruled by paranoia. The wealth of the Orient flowed through its port, creating a facade of prosperity that masked a deep, terminal sickness. The Hospitallers, headquartered in a massive fortified complex overlooking the sea, were one of the city's most powerful factions. They, along with their bitter rivals, the Knights Templar, represented the only real military power left. But it was a power trapped within the city walls. The Mamluk Sultanate, under the relentless Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, had consolidated its power and was now preparing the final blow. In April of 1291, a Mamluk army of unimaginable size appeared before the walls of Acre. Chroniclers speak of over 100,000 infantry and cavalry and a terrifying array of siege engines, massive catapults that could hurl boulders capable of shattering stone walls. Inside the city, the defenders numbered perhaps 15,000, a mix of local troops, the garrisons of the military orders, and a few thousand reinforcements hastily shipped from Europe. The odds were not just long, they were apocalyptic. The Siege of Acre was the final bloody act in the 200-year drama of the Crusades in the Holy Land. It was not a battle, it was an execution. For 6 weeks, the city was subjected to a relentless bombardment. The Mamluk siege engineers, the best in the world, systematically dismantled Acre's legendary defenses. Day and night, the thunder of the catapults was a constant, terrifying drumbeat, punctuated by the crash of collapsing towers and the screams of the wounded. The Hospitallers fought with the desperate courage of cornered lions. They led counterattacks, rushing out from the city gates to try and burn the enemy's siege engines. They plugged breaches in the walls with their own bodies, holding back waves of attackers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Grand Master of the hospital, Jean de Villiers, was grievously wounded but refused to leave the front lines. The pages of the chronicles are filled with their acts of suicidal bravery. But bravery was not enough. The Mamluks were too numerous, too organized, too determined. They tunneled under the walls, packing the mines with explosives. Tower after tower, gate after gate, the defenses crumbled. The city descended into chaos. The Italian merchant communes, seeing the end was near, focused only on evacuating their citizens and their wealth, clogging the harbor with their ships and often refusing to take refugees who could not pay. Betrayal was rampant, discipline collapsed. Only the military orders, the Hospitallers and the Templars maintained their cohesion, fighting street by street, house by house, as the Mamluks poured into the doomed city. The final assault came on the 18th of May. Under the cover of a dust storm, the Mamluks breached the walls in multiple places at once. What followed was a massacre. The Christian soldiers and citizens were overwhelmed. The fighting devolved into a desperate, chaotic slaughter in the narrow streets. The Hospitallers fell back to their own fortified compound, a fortress within the city. It was a hopeless last stand. The Mamluk tide was unstoppable. The Grand Master, Jean de Villiers, barely conscious from his wounds, was carried by his knights through the carnage to one of the last ships remaining in the harbor. He did not want to leave, but his brothers insisted that the order must survive, even if the city was lost. From the deck of his galley, he watched as the city that had been their home for a century was consumed by fire and sword. The last pockets of resistance were wiped out. The great Templar fortress, where thousands of civilians had taken refuge, held out for a few more days before its undermined walls collapsed, killing defenders and attackers alike. The fall of Acre was complete. The dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was over, drowned in blood. On the shores of Acre, they learned the final cruel lesson of the Holy Land. God provides the cause, but men provide the defeat. The Hospitallers, the few who had managed to escape, were now homeless refugees, a military order with no land to defend, a hospital with no one to heal. They sailed to the island of Cyprus, a kingdom still under Crusader rule, but they were guests, not masters. For over a decade, the order drifted rudderless and demoralized. They had lost everything, their purpose, their home, their vast estates on the mainland. In Europe, questions were being asked. With the Holy Land lost, what was the point of the military orders? Were they now just a collection of wealthy, obsolete warrior monks? Their great rivals, the Templars, would fall victim to this crisis of purpose. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, coveting their wealth, would arrest every Templar in his kingdom, charging them with heresy and dissolving their order in a brutal campaign of torture and executions. The Hospitallers watched, and they understood that to survive, they had to prove their continued relevance. They had to find a new enemy, a new purpose, a new war. They were a predator without a territory, and a predator without a territory does not simply lie down and die. It adapts, it finds a new hunting ground, and it becomes even more dangerous. Their eyes, once fixed on Jerusalem, now turned to the sea, to the rich trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean, and to a rugged, well-fortified island held by the declining Byzantine Empire. An island that could become their fortress, their kingdom, their new front line in the eternal war against Islam. An island called Rhodes. Facing total annihilation, they chose to attack a fortified island. Was this an act of mad desperation or strategic genius? Let us know. Were they driven by faith in their divine mission, or by the sheer brutal instinct of a cornered predator? A predator without a territory does not die, it adapts. Grand Master Foulques de Villeret, a man of audacious vision and ruthless pragmatism, understood this. Cyprus was a gilded cage, and the courts of Europe were a viper's nest of political intrigue. The order needed its own sovereign territory, a base from which to continue its holy war and justify its existence. In 1306, he launched one of the most daring gambles in the order's history. Without the official blessing of the Pope or any major European monarch, he assembled a fleet and an army and set out to conquer the island of Rhodes. It was an audacious act of piracy sanctioned by divine purpose. Rhodes was technically part of the Byzantine Empire, a Christian state, but the Byzantines were too weak to effectively control it, and the island had become a haven for pirates and a target for Turkish raiders. The Hospitallers presented their invasion as a necessary act to secure a Christian outpost against the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. The campaign was long and brutal, lasting nearly 4 years. The knights, masters of land warfare, had to learn the difficult art of amphibious assaults and naval blockades. But in August of 1309, the city of Rhodes finally fell. The Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, the homeless refugees from Acre, were now the sovereign rulers of their own island state. They were no longer guests or vassals, they were princes. The conquest of Rhodes fundamentally transformed the order. They had been a land-based power, their strength in their castles and heavy cavalry. Now they had to become a naval power. The sea was their new desert, the ship their new warhorse. They immediately began constructing a formidable fleet of war galleys, light, fast ships powered by both sail and oar, perfectly suited for the coastal raiding and anti-piracy operations that would become their hallmark. Rhodes, with its magnificent natural harbour, became one of the most fortified naval bases in the world. The city was encased in some of the most advanced fortifications of the era, a labyrinth of massive walls, deep moats, and powerful bastions, each section defended by one of the langues, the national divisions of the order: France, Auvergne, Provence, Italy, Spain, England, and Germany. But this new naval empire required a new kind of economy. Fortifications and fleets were ruinously expensive. The profits from their European estates were no longer enough. So the Knights of Rhodes, the sworn defenders of the faith, became something else. They became corsairs, God's pirates. Their galleys, flying the white cross on a red field, became the terror of the Aegean. They preyed on Muslim shipping, raiding Ottoman coastal towns, seizing cargo, and taking thousands of prisoners to be sold in the slave markets of Rhodes or to be chained to the oars of their own galleys. This was the ultimate paradox. The order, founded to care for the sick and the poor, now sustained itself through plunder and human trafficking. Their great hospital in Rhodes was a marvel of medical science, but its operations were funded by the immense profits of their corsairing enterprise. The vow of poverty was twisted into a bizarre new form. The individual knight remained poor, owning nothing, but the order's treasury swelled with captured silks, spices, and gold. They justified this as a holy war. They were, in their eyes, weakening the enemy, freeing Christian captives, and using the spoils to defend Christendom. But the line between holy war and piracy is thin, a line drawn in the water by the wake of a war galley. They attacked any ship flying an enemy flag, and sometimes the flags were conveniently ambiguous. They became a major player in the Mediterranean slave trade, both as suppliers and consumers. The image of a knight of St. John, a monk bound by vows of piety and charity, overseeing the sale of human beings in the public square, is a deeply unsettling one. It is the image of an organization that has so completely adapted to its violent world that it has begun to mirror the very enemies it professes to despise. They traded their pilgrims' caravans for treasure galleys and their vow of poverty for a cut of the richest trade routes in the world. Salvation, it turned out, was very profitable. For 2 centuries, the Knights of Rhodes were a Christian thorn in the side of the rising Ottoman Empire. They were a constant nuisance, disrupting trade, raiding coastal territories, and providing a forward base for any potential new crusade from the West. They were a symbol of defiance, an island of militant Christianity in a sea of expanding Islamic power. Their fleet was the first line of defense for Christian Europe, engaging Ottoman fleets in dozens of brutal naval battles. They fought with the same discipline and fanaticism that had characterized them in the Holy Land. Aboard the cramped, brutal confines of a war galley, combat was a visceral, bloody affair of ramming, boarding, and savage hand-to-hand fighting. The knights, clad in full plate armor even under the blistering Mediterranean sun, led the boarding parties, their heavy swords cleaving through the lightly armored Ottoman sailors and marines. Their victories were many, their reputation for naval prowess legendary. They were the shield of the West, and they reveled in their role. They were no longer just healers who fought. They were warriors, sailors, and pirates, a unique and deadly combination. But their very success made their destruction an imperial necessity for the Ottomans. The island of Rhodes sat directly on the vital sea lanes connecting the Ottoman capital of Istanbul with its newly conquered and incredibly wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria. The knights were a dagger pointed at the heart of the Ottoman supply line. As the 16th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire reached the zenith of its power under a new, brilliant, and ambitious sultan. He was a man who called himself the lawgiver, a poet, a strategist, and a conqueror who would preside over the empire's golden age. The Europeans knew him by a more fearsome name, the Magnificent, and he could not, would not, tolerate this nest of Christian vipers, this serpent's nest as he called it, sitting astride his empire's lifeline. In 1521, after conquering Belgrade and securing his European frontier, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent turned his full attention southward. He assembled one of the largest armadas the world had ever seen, a fleet of hundreds of ships carrying an army of over 100,000 elite soldiers, including his fearsome Janissaries. Their destination was Rhodes. Their mission was not to punish the knights, but to utterly annihilate them. The epic siege of giants was about to begin. Empires do not tolerate thorns in their flesh, they pluck them out. For Suleiman the Magnificent, the Knights of St. John on Rhodes were a festering wound, a constant source of irritation, and a strategic impediment to his grand ambitions. In the summer of 1522, the Ottoman armada arrived. It was a forest of masts that filled the horizon, a terrifying spectacle of imperial power. Against this overwhelming force, the Grand Master of the Order, Philippe de Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, a stern and brilliant French nobleman, could muster only about 600 knights and perhaps 6,000 mercenaries and Rhodian militia. The city of Rhodes was a fortress, perhaps the most advanced in the world, but it was an island of stone in a sea of enemies. The siege that followed was a 6-month epic of unrelenting savage warfare, a contest of engineering genius, artillery power, and sheer human endurance. Suleiman's army landed and encircled the city, digging a vast network of trenches and setting up batteries of massive siege cannons. The bombardment that began was on a scale never before seen in history. For months, the city was pounded day and night. Stone walls that had stood for a century were pulverized into dust. The air was thick with smoke and the constant deafening roar of the guns. The knights and their soldiers lived in a perpetual hell of noise, dust, and death. The defense of Rhodes was a masterpiece of military engineering and desperate courage. L'Isle-Adam was everywhere, shoring up defenses, encouraging his men, and leading counterattacks. The knights, commanding their sectors of the wall according to their lang, fought with a cold, professional fury. When the Ottoman cannons blasted a breach in the wall, the knights would be waiting in the rubble, their heavy armor and two-handed swords forming a living wall of steel against the waves of janissaries who charged into the gap. The fighting in the breaches was brutal, a medieval nightmare of hacking, stabbing, and screaming, fought over piles of rubble and the bodies of the dead and dying. The Ottomans also employed a vast corps of miners who tunneled towards the walls, intending to plant massive explosive charges. The defenders dug countermines, meeting the Ottomans in terrifying pitch-black combat underground. The siege became a three-dimensional battle, on the walls, under the walls, and in the skies, which were filled with projectiles. But the defenders were bleeding, dying, and running out of everything: gunpowder, food, and hope. L'Isle-Adam had sent desperate pleas for a relief force from Europe, but none came. The Christian princes were too busy fighting each other to unite against the common enemy. The Knights of Rhodes were on their own. By December, the situation was hopeless. The city was a ruin, the walls were gone, and the defenders were reduced to a handful of exhausted, wounded men. Suleiman, who admired the knights' bravery and was losing thousands of his own elite troops in every assault, offered generous terms of surrender. L'Isle-Adam could leave with his surviving knights, their weapons, their treasures, and any citizen of Rhodes who wished to go with them. It was a testament to the respect the knights had earned from their greatest enemy. After a bitter debate within the Order's council, L'Isle-Adam accepted the inevitable. On the first day of 1523, the handful of surviving knights, their banners flying, marched out of the city they had held for 214 years. Suleiman the Magnificent, in a gesture of supreme respect, forbade his troops from lining the streets to jeer their defeated foes. He even met with the aged Grand Master, offering him words of comfort, saying, "It is not without regret that I am forced to expel this old man from his home." At Rhodes, they lost a home but forged a legend. Sometimes the most glorious victory is a beautifully executed defeat. Once again, the Order of St. John was homeless, a government without a country, an army without a fortress. They wandered the Mediterranean for 7 years, a pathetic remnant of their former glory. They were a fleet of refugees, carrying their archives, their holy relics, and their wounded pride from port to port, begging for a new home. The great powers of Europe admired their heroic defense of Rhodes, but no one was willing to grant them a piece of valuable territory. Finally, in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V made them an offer. He would grant them the archipelago of Malta, a small, barren, and strategically vital group of islands south of Sicily. It was not a generous gift. Malta was a rocky, waterless wasteland with a poor harbour and pathetic fortifications. Its people were poor and spoke a language a mix of Arabic and Italian. The Knights Commission described it as a fief of rock and arid soil. The annual rent was a single falcon, to be presented each year to the Emperor's viceroy in Sicily. Many knights were insulted. This was a far cry from the lush, wealthy island of Rhodes. But they had no choice. They were beggars, and Malta was the only home on offer. They accepted. It was on this barren rock that they would make their final, most desperate, and most glorious stand. Upon arriving in Malta, the knights immediately began doing what they did best: building. They understood that their new home was on the front line of the war between Christendom and the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman had defeated them, but he had not destroyed them. From Malta, their galleys could once again threaten the sea lanes between Istanbul and North Africa. They were once again a thorn, and they knew that one day the Sultan would come to pluck it out. They chose the natural harbour of Birgu as their new headquarters and began to transform it into a fortress. For 35 years, they poured all their resources, all their engineering genius, into fortifying the island. They built new bastions, deepened the moats, and constructed two powerful new forts, St. Elmo and St. Michael, to guard the entrances to the Grand Harbour. They knew the attack would come, and they prepared for it with the grim determination of men who had already lost one home and were damned if they would lose another. The Grand Master now was Jean Parisot de la Valette, a 70-year-old French nobleman, a veteran of the siege of Rhodes, a man as hard and unyielding as the Maltese rock he now commanded. He had spent a year as a galley slave in the Ottoman fleet, and his hatred for the enemy was personal and absolute. He knew that the coming battle would not be for territory, but for survival. It would be a fight to the death. In May of 1565, the lookout on Fort St. Elmo sighted the vanguard of the Ottoman armada. The great siege of Malta had begun. Malta was not a gift. It was an insult, a barren rock offered as a pittance to the heroes of Rhodes. But in the hands of the Knights of St. John, it would become an altar upon which the fate of the Mediterranean would be decided. When the Ottoman fleet arrived in May of 1565, it was even more powerful than the one that had taken Rhodes. Nearly 200 ships carrying over 40,000 elite soldiers, including thousands of janissaries, the Sultan's personal infantry. Against this mighty host, Grand Master Jean de la Valette had roughly 700 knights and 8,000 Maltese and mercenary troops. The knights knew this was not a battle for a fortress, it was a battle for the existence of their order, and, as they saw it, for the soul of Christendom. The Ottoman plan was to first capture the small, star-shaped fort of St. Elmo, which guarded the entrance to the two main harbours. They calculated it would take them a few days. It took them over a month. The defence of St. Elmo was one of the most heroic and brutal episodes in the history of warfare. A few hundred knights and soldiers held out against the entire Ottoman army, enduring a non-stop point-blank artillery barrage that reduced the fort to a pile of rubble. They fought from behind shattered walls in trenches filled with their own dead. Every night, a few reinforcements would be rowed across the harbour from the main fortress of Birgu, and every day the Ottomans would launch massive assaults. The defenders knew they were a suicide squad, buying time for La Valette to strengthen the main defences. They sold their lives dearly, inflicting horrific casualties on the attackers. When the fort finally fell, the Ottomans found only a handful of wounded defenders left. In a fit of rage, the Ottoman commander had their bodies decapitated, their hearts cut out, and the corpses crucified on planks of wood to be floated across the harbour towards the main fortress. La Valette's response was equally grim. He had his Ottoman prisoners decapitated and fired their heads from his cannons back into the enemy camp. There would be no mercy, no quarter. This was a war of annihilation. The fall of St. Elmo was a victory for the Ottomans, but a catastrophic one. They had lost thousands of their best troops and a precious month of the campaigning season. Now they turned their full fury on the two main Hospitaller strongholds, the fortified towns of Birgu and Senglea. For the next 2 months, the siege became a vision of hell on earth. Under the blistering Maltese summer sun, The defenders endured constant bombardment, disease, and starvation. The fighting was relentless and savage. The Ottomans launched dozens of massive assaults, sending waves of janissaries against the crumbling walls. The knights, their red surcoats black with gunpowder and blood, were always at the forefront, leading the defense. The 70-year-old La Valette himself fought in the breaches, a pike in his hand, refusing to seek treatment for a leg wound. The civilian population of Malta, men, women and children, fought alongside the knights, rebuilding walls, carrying ammunition, and pouring boiling oil on the attackers. It was a total war. The hospital of the order was overflowing with wounded, the surgeons working day and night in apocalyptic conditions. Priests moved through the ranks, offering last rites to men who knew they would likely be dead within the hour. On Malta, they ran out of gunpowder, men, and hope. All they had left was fury, and it turned out to be enough. The climax of the siege came in August. The Ottomans launched a final massive assault on both Birgu and Senglea simultaneously. They breached the walls in several places and poured into the town of Birgu. The battle raged in the streets, a chaotic, desperate struggle. It seemed the end had finally come. But at that critical moment, a small cavalry detachment from the island's old capital of Medina, which had been largely ignored by the Ottomans, swept down and attacked the unprotected Ottoman rear camp, burning tents and slaughtering the sick and wounded. The Ottoman commander, hearing the chaos behind him and fearing that a large Christian relief force had finally landed, ordered a retreat from the breach. It was a fatal mistake. The moment of crisis passed. The defenders had held. The morale of the Ottoman army, already battered by enormous casualties and ravaged by disease, finally broke. By September, with the autumn storms approaching and a small Spanish relief force having finally landed on the island, the Ottoman commanders realized the siege was lost. They abandoned their guns, boarded their ships and sailed away. They had lost perhaps 30,000 men, a third of their army. The tiny garrison of knights and Maltese had defeated the greatest empire on earth. The news of the victory at Malta sent a shockwave across Europe. It was a turning point, the moment the myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. The Knights of St. John were no longer heroes, they were legends. In the aftermath of the siege, a grateful Europe showered the order with money and praise. With these funds, La Valette began the construction of a magnificent new, fortified city on the peninsula, where Fort St. Elmo had stood. It would be named in his honor, Valletta. This city would be a fortress palace, a monument to their victory and a symbol of their enduring power. The Great Siege of Malta was the Order's finest hour, the glorious culmination of their 500-year evolution from humble healers to elite warriors. They had faced Armageddon and won. But victory can be a more insidious enemy than any army. The warrior who has won his great war often finds himself lost in the peace that follows. What do you do when your life's purpose, the defense of your home against an overwhelming foe, has been achieved? The knights had proven themselves the greatest warriors in Christendom. Now they would have to prove they could survive their own success. The Knights of Malta won an impossible victory, but what was the true source of their strength? Was it their unbreakable military discipline, or was it the sheer force of their fanatical religious faith? Cast your vote in the comments below. Peace is a deadlier poison to a warrior than any blade. After the Great Siege, the Ottoman Empire never again attempted a full-scale invasion of Malta. The knights had won their security, and in doing so they began to lose their purpose. The magnificent city of Valletta rose from the ashes of the siege, a Baroque masterpiece of military architecture, adorned with splendid palaces, churches and auberges for each of the langues. The order entered its golden age. Malta became a sovereign principality, a cosmopolitan hub of trade, and a fashionable destination for the younger sons of Europe's aristocracy. To be a Knight of Malta was a mark of supreme prestige. But the fierce, pious, battle-hardened warrior of the 16th century slowly gave way to the powdered, dueling, intrigue-loving courtier of the 17th and 18th centuries. The focus shifted from the defense of the faith to the management of vast estates, from the grim realities of the battlefield to the lavish ceremonies of the Grand Master's court. The spirit of La Valette was replaced by the spirit of Versailles. They had defeated the world's greatest empire only to be conquered from within by the comforts of their own success. The Order's corsairing activities continued and even intensified, but what had once been a holy war against the infidel now looked more and more like simple, profit-driven piracy. The galleys of the Order, the famous Corso, were a major economic engine for the island state. They continued to raid Ottoman shipping and North African coastlines, but their methods grew more brutal and their targets less discriminate. The slave market in Valletta flourished. Thousands of captured Muslims were sold into bondage, their labor used to build the island's magnificent fortifications and row its galleys. This reliance on slavery created a deep moral rot at the heart of the Order. The Sacra Infermeria, the great hospital in Valletta, was a wonder of the medical world. It offered a level of care centuries ahead of its time, treating thousands of patients in its vast, vaulted ward. But the very existence of this monument to Christian charity was underwritten by the brutal profits of human trafficking. The paradox that had defined the Order since its birth in Jerusalem had reached its most grotesque and hypocritical conclusion. They healed the sick with one hand and signed slave manifests with the other. Internal discipline, once the bedrock of the Order's strength, began to erode. The knights were still bound by their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but these vows were often observed in the breach. The vow of poverty was circumvented by a complex system of allowances and commanderies that allowed individual knights to live in luxury. The vow of chastity was notoriously flouted, with duels over mistresses becoming a common occurrence. The vow of obedience to the Grand Master was often challenged by factionalism and political intrigue as the different langues vied for power and influence. The military drills and austere lifestyle of the past were replaced by lavish banquets, hunting parties, and courtly pursuits. They were still a military force, their navy still one of the best in the Mediterranean, but the fire had gone out of them. They were no longer a brotherhood of fanatical warriors united by a sacred cause. They had become a wealthy, aristocratic, and deeply complacent corporation. Their greatest enemy was no longer the Ottoman Sultan, but their own boredom and decadence. As the 18th century drew to a close, a new and more dangerous threat emerged, not from the East, but from the heart of Europe itself. The ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution swept across the continent, challenging the very foundations of the old aristocratic and religious order upon which the Knights of Malta was built. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were antithetical to the order's hierarchical, aristocratic structure. In France, the revolution confiscated all of the order's vast and ancient properties, crippling their finances. Many of the French knights, who formed the majority of the order, were sympathetic to the new ideas, further dividing the institution. The order seemed like a relic of a bygone era, a feudal anachronism in a world being reborn in the fires of revolution. They were a hollow shell, magnificent on the outside, but rotten within. Their legendary fortress, which had withstood the full might of Suleiman the Magnificent, was now commanded by knights who were more concerned with their noble lineage than with the state of their cannons. They were completely unprepared for the storm that was gathering, a storm personified by a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless French general whose strategic vision was about to redraw the map of Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The storm did not knock on the door. It simply arrived. In June of 1798, a colossal French fleet appeared off the coast of Malta. It was the fleet of Napoleon Bonaparte on its way to conquer Egypt, and it carried an army of over 30,000 veterans of the Italian campaign. Napoleon demanded entry to the Grand Harbour to take on water and supplies. The Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch, a weak and indecisive German, dithered. He knew that allowing the entire fleet into the harbour was tantamount to surrender, so he offered to allow only a few ships in at a time, citing Malta's neutrality. It was a feeble excuse, and Napoleon knew it. He had long coveted Malta as a strategic naval base to control the central Mediterranean. He used Hompesch's refusal as a pretext to invade. The French army landed at several points on the island, meeting almost no resistance. The descendants of the heroes of the Great Siege, the men whose predecessors had fought to the last drop of blood against the Ottomans, simply laid down their arms. The Maltese militia, disgusted by the knights' cowardice, refused to fight for them. The French knights within the order refused to fight against their countrymen. The whole magnificent defense system, the product of centuries of engineering and sacrifice, collapsed in a matter of hours. The fall of Malta was a tragicomedy of shame and betrayal. Grand Master Hompesch, locked in his palace in Valletta, panicked. He was surrounded by defeatist advisors and faced with a population on the verge of revolt. Without consulting his full council, and after only 1 day of token resistance, he surrendered the impregnable fortress and the entire island to Napoleon Bonaparte. The great warrior monks, the terror of the Mediterranean, capitulated without a single significant battle. The fortress of Malta did not fall to cannon fire. It dissolved in a puddle of apathy and forgotten vows. Napoleon was astounded by his good fortune. He rode into Valletta in triumph and, in a mere 6 days, dismantled the order's 268-year rule. He looted the churches, seized the order's treasury, abolished feudalism, and established a French administration. He then sailed for Egypt, leaving a French garrison behind. The knights were given a few days to leave the island. They were expelled, humiliated, and stripped of their home and purpose. Once again, they were exiles, but this time was different. After Acre, they were heroes. After Rhodes, they were legends. After Malta, they were a disgrace. It was the most inglorious end imaginable for the oldest and proudest military order in Christendom. The Order of St. John, scattered and broken, seemed destined for the ash heap of history. They were a historical relic, a symbol of a world that no longer existed. Their military and political power was utterly destroyed. For decades they wandered Europe, a government in exile with no territory, their grand masters residing in various Italian cities. They were at their absolute lowest point, stripped of land, of power, and of honor. The world had moved on. The age of holy war, of knights and crusades, was over. The sword that they had wielded for 7 centuries was shattered beyond repair. It seemed that nothing was left. But in the ruins of their military glory, something of the original mission survived, a flicker of the flame that had been lit by the blessed Gerard in a humble Jerusalem hospital nearly 1,000 years before. When all the fortresses had crumbled and all the battles were lost, only one thing remained: the vow. The original vow to serve our lords, the sick and the poor. Stripped of their sword, they were forced, finally, to pick up the scalpel once more. The path to redemption would be long and arduous, but it would lead them not to a new fortress, but back to their very beginning. When you have lost everything, the only place to go is back to where you started. In the decades following the disaster at Malta, the shattered remnants of the Order of St. John struggled to find a new identity in a world that had no place for warrior monks. They were an anachronism, a punchline to a historical joke. Attempts to regain Malta through political maneuvering failed. The island was taken from the French by the British, who recognized its supreme strategic value and had no intention of ever giving it up. The order was adrift. But this period of humiliation and exile was also a period of profound introspection. Stripped of their military might and political power, they were forced to confront the core of their identity. What was the purpose of the Order of St. John if not to wage war? The answer was there all along, in their full name: the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem. For centuries, the word military had overshadowed the word hospitaller. Now, with the military path closed to them forever, the original mission began to reassert itself. In 1834, the order established its new headquarters in Rome. It was a quiet, unassuming move, but it marked a monumental shift. They had finally officially abandoned the sword. The long, bloody 700-year detour into warfare was over. They were returning to their roots. The transformation was slow but steady. The order reconstituted itself as a purely religious and charitable organization. Its members were still drawn from the Catholic nobility of Europe, but their mission was no longer to fight but to serve. They began to rebuild their hospital network not in fortified castles, but in the growing industrial cities of Europe, where the poor suffered in squalor. They rediscovered their original charism, their unique calling to serve the sick and the poor. The black mantle with the 8-pointed white cross once again became a symbol not of war, but of mercy. The world wars of the 20th century provided the ultimate test of their new identity. During the First World War, the Order ran hospital trains and field hospitals on multiple fronts, treating wounded soldiers from all sides without distinction. Their members, forbidden from fighting, served as medics and ambulance drivers, displaying a different kind of courage on the battlefield. During the Second World War, they once again provided medical services, saving countless lives amidst the carnage. The cross that had once been carried into battle was now a sign of sanctuary in a world gone mad. They had come full circle. The hands that had once wielded swords in the breaches of Acre and Rhodes were now, through their successors, binding the wounds of the fallen in Flanders and Normandy. Today, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is a unique global entity. It is recognized as a sovereign subject of international law, maintaining diplomatic relations with over 100 countries and a permanent observer status at the United Nations. It has no territory save for 2 buildings in Rome, but its kingdom is the global landscape of human suffering. It is one of the world's most important and effective humanitarian organizations. Its thousands of members and volunteers run hospitals, ambulance corps and relief services in over 120 countries. They are on the front lines of famine, natural disasters, epidemics and war zones. They provide medical care to refugees, food to the starving, and shelter to the homeless. They still serve our lords, the sick and the poor, just as the Blessed Gerard did 900 years ago. The 8-pointed Maltese cross is now one of the most recognized symbols of emergency medical aid in the world. The journey has been astonishing, from a humble infirmary to a military superpower, from a pirate state to a disgraced relic, and finally to a global force for good. They spent 800 years learning that the greatest fortress is not made of stone, but of compassion, and the sharpest weapon is not a sword, but a scalpel in a skilled hand. The story of the Hospitallers is a cautionary tale, a lesson written in blood and stone across 1,000 years of history. It is the story of how a noble ideal, the desire to do good, can be twisted and corrupted by the very violence it employs to defend itself. They became the most effective warriors of their time, but in mastering the art of killing, they came perilously close to losing the soul they were fighting to protect. Their history is a relentless series of paradoxes: pious slave traders, charitable pirates, warrior monks who were both heroes and hypocrites. They were forced to become monsters to fight monsters, and in the process the line between the two often disappeared. Yet ultimately their story is one of redemption. After centuries of wandering in a wilderness of violence and power, they found their way home, not to Jerusalem, not to Rhodes, not to Malta, but back to the simple, profound vow of their founder. They proved that an institution, like a person, can change, can learn from its sins, and can be reborn. The sword has been laid to rest, perhaps forever. The scalpel remains sharper and more necessary than ever. Their story is a path from the scalpel to the sword and back to the scalpel. They proved they could be both great healers and ruthless warriors. But what do you think truly changes the world for the better? Unbending strength capable of protecting the good, or boundless mercy capable of healing even the enemy? Write your choice in the comments, and let's decide what lesson we've learned from their incredible story.